Twilight's horn lit up, and magic surrounded the pendant on her neck, causing the crystal to light up the area before her. The door opened to the hallway, and a red carpet floor that looked like it had seen better days. The color was worn with age, and a layer of dust seemed to be covering it. The cream-colored wallpaper was peeling and seemed to be covered in scratches. She could see the reception desk from the entrance. "Whoa, what happened to this place?" Spike wondered aloud as Twilight walked over to the desk. "I'm not sure, Spike, but we should probably keep our voices to a whisper," Twilight whispered back to the dragon on her back as she approached the rotten wooden desk. Her eyes began to scan for what lay upon it. "Why do a whisper?" Spike asked quietly. "If there are other ponies, wouldn't we want them to know we're here? We could also attract some more of those zombie things from outside, if they're in here," Twilight replied. "The medallion's quiet so far, but I don't want a chance at having to fight something. At least, not with you in harm's way." "Twilight," Spike spoke softly, but was interrupted as Twilight's horn lit up once more. She picked up a map off the reception desk and quickly examined it. "All right. The layout of the library is pretty simple. We should be able to find any pony who's in here pretty quickly." She rolled the map up and let it vanish into her pool of magic. "And, with any luck, we might find some information, too." Twilight then levitated the note that had been lying next to the map. It was a sloppily written note, as if whoever had wrote it had been in a hurry, but it was just clear enough for her to be able to read what was there. "Oh no, I lost them. I can't believe I lost them. Those things are going to guard them now. I know it. I can't hide inside the back room without them. I'm done for. I won't survive. Oh, Celestia, why did it have to be a puzzle?" "What's it say, Twilight?" Spike looked at the note curiously, not able to get a good look past Twilight's head. "I think it's saying that in order to get to the back room of the library, we need to find items that are being guarded around the library." Twilight gulped softly, vanishing the note into her magic. "So, you're gonna have to fight again." Spike wrapped his arms around Twilight's neck a little tighter, as if hugging her. "Most likely, Spike. If we want to find out what's back there." There wasn't a conclusion Twilight was happy to make, nor was it one she wanted to face, but she'd already killed one creature that was out to kill her. If she kept it to self-defense, she might be able to stay sane. Her eyes wandered to the small dragon on her back, who looked back at her with a hint of fear in his eyes. Besides, she had to protect Spike no matter the cost. She wasn't about to let anything happen to her young assistant. Twilight turned from the reception desk and walked a few paces down the hallway when she saw the first door on her right. A sign next to the door labeled it as the reference section. "Well, I guess that's as good a place as any to start," Twilight said, with a bit of hesitation in her voice. Spike gripped her neck softly as Twilight carefully opened the door. Her light going into the room was able to pick out several bookshelves, all containing several books lined up on them. Most of the books appeared to be worn with age, dust collecting on the shelves and bindings. She stepped quietly into the room, looking back and forth with her light. At the entranceway, she could see large piles of books that had been dropped at the end of the bookshelves, blocking a pony's path from going around. The only path they could take was to go forward between the openings of the shelves. Twilight took a few steps further into the reference section, slowly closing the door behind her, when her ears perked up. Her medallion began to hiss softly. Spike gripped Twilight's neck a little harder, and she instinctively pulled the sword out of her magic, gripping it tight. She stood in place, waiting for whatever creature was causing the hiss to step forth. However, despite standing in place for what felt like an eternity, no creature walked out in front of them. They could only hear the soft hissing of the medallion. Softly swallowing her anxiety, Twilight began to take slow, careful steps forward. The hissing remained quiet for her first few steps, until she was standing in the opening between two bookshelves. The medallion slowly began to buzz louder, but now it was accompanied by the sound of something chewing. She looked to her left, seeing another large pile of books blocking the end of the path. Then she slowly turned to her right. At first she thought she was seeing a pony hunched over a small pile of books, but something was clearly wrong with that. She focused more, and details began to fit into her vision. What she thought was the back of a pony seemed to be made of a rotten brown leather that was moving and bulging, as if giant bookworms lived under the skin. Several areas looked as if they'd been sewn together, like the skin was a suit made out of rotten pony hide. Extending out of all openings of the skin on its back were two purple and red muscle-like tentacles that shaped to a point at the end. Its head lifted up, revealing two flaps of what looked like a pony head falling to the side, revealing skin-stripped and eyeless head that was chewing hungrily on a book. Twilight almost gagged. She could hardly describe the horror of the creature before her. Its head shredded the book in its mouth easily, swallowing the whole cover and the pages. The tentacles on its back suddenly reached out to the bookshelf next to it and stabbed a book straight through its binding. It picked the book up and laid it down next to the small pile the monster had gathered, its head digging back down and grabbing hold of another book. Twilight slowly moved, continuing across the gap in the bookshelves away from the monster. It didn't seem to notice her as the monster disappeared from sight past the bookshelf once more. The medallion's loud buzzing dulled into a soft buzz as she let out a soft sigh. "Twilight, what is that thing?" Spike hissed into her ear, gripping hard against her neck, but being careful not to choke her. "I don't know, Spike," Twilight hissed back, lowering her sword as she continued to back away slowly. "I'd rather avoid it if possible, though." Twilight felt her back bump into a large pile of discarded books. She turned her head to see if the path ended because of the obstruction. She glared at it softly and lit her horn a little brighter, trying to grab hold of the books and move them out of her way. However, the books refused to budge, as if weighed tightly into place. She glared softly and tried teleporting the obstruction out of her way. However, despite the spell casting, the books didn't move. It was as if they were like the locked doors, immune to magic. "What's with this place and its magic immunity?" Twilight growled softly, checking her location in the short maze of bookshelves. She could see the end of the room, counting off 6 bookshelves within the room in total. The large piles of books seemed to be positioned in a perfect way as to direct her straight towards the creature. She quickly pulled the map of the library back out and checked its contents. It seemed that there were 3 rooms just at the other end that were used for studying. However, with her path blocked by the large piles of books, the only route that seemed like it would reach them would be to go through that creature that was devouring books. "Spike?" Twilight spoke softly, yet seriously. "I need you to get off my back for a minute." "Twilight?" Spike said hesitantly. "What are you going to do?" Twilight took a deep breath, closing her eyes and steeling her nerves. She pictured the scene back at the library of Spike torn to pieces. She pictured the creature from that mansion had tried to kill her. She pictured the zombie soldiers, each carrying their weapons, and attempted to cut them down with them. These creatures were cold and harsh. They didn't care for the sanctity of life. They blindly sought to kill and harm. And though she desired to leave them alone, she knew that she couldn't avoid this fate for long now. Though they were living creatures, she had to see them as obstacles, no more than puzzles standing between her and getting out of this miserable situation. To save her friends, to find Celestia, and to let no more harm come to any pony. "Spike, I'm going to take out that creature." She raised the chipped and damaged sword in front of her, looking it over with her eyes. "And if you're on my back, you might get hurt. No matter what, I can't let you get hurt, Spike." "Twilight, no! You shouldn't fight it unless there's no other choice." Spike tugged at her mane, trying to persuade her not to be foolish. "Whatever hurt you, Twilight?" His eyes began to rise. Twilight, eyeing him carefully. "If something happens to you, what am I supposed to do? What do I tell the others if I find them and if you're... Spike shut his eyes as tears burned at them, a lump forming in his throat. Twilight eyed the hallway of the bookshelves carefully. She could still hear the creature devouring away at the books. Its distraction seemed deep. Spike felt himself being shrouded in magic and forcibly lifted off Twilight's back. "Twilight! No! Spike began to shout, but found himself muffled when suddenly embraced deeply into Twilight's chest. His eyes widened as he tried to look up into the lavender unicorn that held him, close to her with one hoof in a hug. "Spike, I know all that," Twilight spoke softly, trying to calm the young dragon. Spike wrapped his arms around her neck and hugged her tightly. "I can't promise I won't get hurt, but I'm not about to die and leave you behind, Spike. I'm also not about to let these things hurt you either. So if I can stop one before it has the chance to strike, I'm going to take that chance." Twilight's voice seemed different to the young dragon's ears. In a way, he very rarely heard Twilight speak. It was as if the voice of a mother was coming from the lavender unicorn now. But... Spike tried to interject, but Twilight just gently shushed him, rubbing his head softly. "Spike, I promise. Everything will be all right." She spoke to calm the young dragon down, and it seemed to be working. "Just wait for me right here. This'll only take me a moment." Spike was quiet for a moment, holding on to Twilight tightly. He didn't want her to have to fight, but the more Twilight's words sunk in, the more he thought about the situation. He began to realize it truly was an inevitable outcome. Okay, just be careful." Spike spoke softly, shifting away from Twilight. Twilight nodded her head and took a deep breath. She could hear the footsteps echo loudly now as she rounded the corner, holding the sword out before her. The creature came into view once more under the shine of her pendant. The creature tore out a large section of paper from its recent book, chewing upon the leaflets of paper before swallowing them messily. Twilight stepped forward towards the creature, and the creature stopped to turn its head. The buzzing of Twilight's medallion began to grow. It glowed feverishly with noise, crying out to her that danger was right in front of her. The tentacles on the creature's back flicked back and forth, the spiked ends seeming to cut through the air as they sailed through it. The creature let out a snarl as its skin moved underneath the flesh it wore, as if more tentacles were waiting to burst out. Twilight narrowed her eyes, keeping her sword even before her, ready for the slight shift in movement from the monster. Even though it had no eyes, she could feel it watching her, waiting for her to make a move. It seemed to want to ambush her, attack her when she wasn't ready for it, but she wouldn't give it that chance. She could feel a small sweat forming on her brow. The creature wasn't going to budge, and if she showed her back to it, it was going to strike. She would have to make the first move. Her hoof took another step closer. The creature let out a wail as the serpent-like tentacles struck out at her. They sailed through the air, intent on getting her blood. Without a moment's hesitation, her sword swung broadly, striking both of the offending appendages. They flew to the side as she drew closer once more. The creature turned now to face the unicorn, challenging it, letting out another screech at its foe. The foul odor of its breath hit Twilight's nose. She grit her teeth and raised the sword to swing down at its head. One of the tentacles came striking down towards her. Her sword quickly sailed through the air, striking the limb and stopping it just short of slashing her. She poured her magic into the sword and slashed it furiously against the limb. The creature cried out as the spiked end of its tentacle flew off, carrying a trail of blood with it. Blinded by the pain, the creature charged Twilight, opening its mouth wide, intent on biting down on her. The sword moved swiftly towards her, her magic holding it tightly. With a thrust, the sword struck the creature, burying itself deep inside of its open mouth. Twilight dodged out of the way as the creature crashed into the bookshelf, writhing in pain and smashing its head against the bookcase to remove the horrible item that had been lodged into its throat. Her horn lit up and engulfed the sword inside the creature, swiftly pulling it out of it. The creature gagged and roared as blood spilled from its mouth, lifting what it would dare to call a hoof to its throat, grabbing for some relief. The single sharp tentacle that remained thrashed around haphazardly, striking books and the shelves in an attempt to defend its own. Twilight wasted no time and aimed the sword. With a loud cry, she thrust the sword forward, impaling the creature through the side of its head. The sword embedded into the bookshelf behind it, nailing the creature to the surface. The creature writhed for a moment longer, trying desperately to cling to what remained of its life, before finally falling limp, the tentacle crashing from its position in the air. Twilight breathed heavily, letting the shock of the moment sink in. She'd been focused. She had been calculating. She had been carefully seeing through the creature's movements, and had struck it down when it was most vulnerable. "I don't get it, Princess." A young Twilight spoke as she walked through the training grounds with her teacher. "How come your soldiers fight so hard to fight when there's no fights in Equestria?" She admired the several stallions, each wielding swords in different manner, as they struck wooden mannequins. Some wielded weighted wooden practice swords as they sparred with each other, ensuring they're in top shape. Well, Celestia thought her words carefully. It's true that peace has reigned during my rule for a very long time now. It wasn't always that way. There are still times when ponies or other creatures would rather settle things with hooves than with words. She spoke solemnly. But it's not just for those moments. We live in a world filled with creatures that wish to do us harm. There are many creatures who would enjoy feasting upon ponies as a snack. What? Really? Filly Twilight looked up at her teacher with big, sorrowful eyes, scared at the idea of something in the world might be coming to eat her. Celestia looked down at the sight and softly chuckled. Never fear, Twilight. I work every day to ensure peace remains in Equestria. The princess smiled sincerely. And if you're so worried about your safety, you can always partake in practicing your own swordsmanship between downtime and your studies. Really? Twilight spoke curiously, looking back at the guards. One of the white Pegasus guards, having overheard the conversation, slowly walked over to the small filly, smiling as he looked down at her. Hello there. He spoke proudly, but sincerely. Twilight backed up a little, almost frightened. I heard you'd be interested in some sword training. How'd you like to try? He asked, holding out the wooden sword he'd been practicing with. Twilight looked at the sword hesitantly, before moving a hoof over to touch it. The Pegasus guard moved it appropriately towards her. She grabbed the sword with both hooves as he let go of it. Twilight dropped her to the ground with the weight of the equipment. She got on her hooves and lifted as hard as her little legs could lift the sword, only managing to lift it a little ways off the ground. She panted heavily as she gave up trying to lift it. This gave a chuckle to both the guard and the princess. Here, I'll go get you a lighter sword, the ones we use when the young foals like yourself want to practice the swordsmanship. The guard smiled, picking up the wooden sword with his teeth, and turning back to the training grounds, heading for the equipment shed. Why are those things so heavy? Twilight grumbled, folding her hooves as she sat on the ground defeated. It's because of the material of a real sword. To make them strong and reliable also makes them heavy. So the training swords are weighted. Celestia smiled explainingly. Have you taken an interest in training with a sword? A little. Twilight thought it over in her head, before standing up on her hooves and smiling. I want to become a great unicorn magician, and if practicing sword fighting with magic will help my studies overall. She seemed eagerly excited. Besides, if I learn magic, How often will I need to fight with a sword? Twilight and Celestia shared a small laugh. Is it safe? Spike asked cautiously, peeking his head around the corner. Twilight looked over at the baby dragon, seeing his eyes filled with fear. Yeah. Twilight spoke softly, looking down at her medallion. The buzzing had come to a stop. It's safe now. Twilight vanished the sword back into her magic, as the body of the creature slumped to the ground. She stared at it solemnly as the baby dragon slowly walked over to her. The scene truly was sinking in. She had killed yet another living creature, and this time she'd done it on purpose. But this was also different. As she felt the young dragon wrap its arms around her front leg, she was reminded of why she had done it. Right now, she had to protect Spike. She was the adult here. She had to be the one to comfort him. She had to remember she wasn't a little filly anymore. Once all this was over, she could mourn over the lives she cut short. But until that time came, she had to focus. Her only focus had to be on the safety of Spike and returning Ponyville back to the way it had been. Twilight carefully lifted Spike up onto her back, and finally walked past the creature. Rounding the corner of the bookshelf, her light fell upon the back of the reference section. She could see a broken-down door that would have led to one of the study rooms in the back. She walked over to it and pressed her hoof against the door, finding the door broken and lodged in place. There would be no getting into this room. With a soft sigh, she turned her head to the left and saw the second door from the back. Through this door, it looked to be intact. The third door appeared to be buried behind a pile of discarded books and desks. Twilight approached the middle door carefully and placed her hoof against it. Her medallion wasn't buzzing yet, which put some confidence into her hooves. She pushed the door open, not certain of what she would see next. The study room was surprisingly well lit, a lantern hanging from the center of the room. Unlike the rest of the library, the room didn't appear to be falling apart. The walls were painted with a simple cream coat, the simple wooden pattern on the bottom. A table sat in the middle of the room, set for anybody to come in and start studying. On the table were only two items that sat right next to each other: a few sheets of paper and what looked like a large jigsaw piece. "What is that?" Spike asked, looking at the large puzzle piece that lay on the table. It had several lines on it, seeming to be part of a bigger picture. Twilight couldn't quite decipher what was going on the piece. It looked like it might have been a picture of a mural. Twilight hummed softly, looking at the puzzle piece, before pulling out the sheet from the lobby desk and reading part of it out loud. "I lost them. I can't believe I lost them. Those things are going to guard them now. I know it. Why did it have to be a puzzle?" She looked at the note up and down, and to the puzzle piece, before making the paper disappear. "Spike, I think this is what the note was talking about. Pieces of a puzzle that, when gathered together, will unlock the door to the back room." Twilight levitated the puzzle piece before placing it into her magic. "I guess that makes sense. How many pieces do you think there are?" Spike asked aloud. "And are they going to be guarded by one of those things?" A shiver rolled down his spine. "I don't know. It's a pretty big piece, so I'd assume there's not many of them," Twilight pondered. "And they might each be guarded." She put a hoof to her chin in thought, thinking about their current predicament. If only there was a way to know where the other pieces would be. "How about the locator spell?" Spike suggested quickly. "A locator spell?" Twilight blinked before a light bulb seemed to go off in her head. "Spike, you're a genius!" She smiled as she pulled out a map and the puzzle piece. "Well, you know, I try." Spike chuckled, accepting the compliment with his usual graciousness. Twilight flattened the map out on the table and floated the puzzle piece above it. "All right. This puzzle is part of a whole. I should be able to use this spell to locate the missing pieces of it and show us where they're located." Twilight concentrated her magic on the piece. The piece began to glow brightly as invisible strings of ether shot out into the library, connecting the separate pieces of the puzzle. The piece then shot down 3 separate beams of light onto the map, marking the separate locations of which each piece were located. Once the spell was complete, she vanished the piece back into her magic and looked over the map, observing their locations. All right, it seems there's only 3 more pieces of the puzzle. Twilight scanned carefully, checking each of the locations that had been marked. 2 appear to be in the main section of the library, and the 3rd is in another study room. If we head straight for them, we'll get to the back room quickly. Twilight smiled, placing her hoof against the back door, a back room section of the library. I don't know, Twilight. It's likely that the main section of the library became a maze just like the reference area did. Spike looked over the map a little worried. Well, perhaps, but I guess we'll find out later, Twilight said, putting the map away once more. Her eyes fell upon the papers that lay on the table next, reading a large title that read, "The Cat Who Married a Mouse." She blinked confused before beginning to read out of curiosity. Once upon a time, there was a cat who made an acquaintance with a mouse. They knew each other so well that they grew to be friends and gained love. So they decided to wed. The married couple lived their lives in peace. One day in the summer, they realized their need to store food for the winter. Together they found a beautiful piece of meat covered in fat and sealed it in a jar. To keep it safe, they hid the jar in an abandoned field so that others could not find it. However, the cat began to long for the meat and dreamt to lie to tell the mouse. When the mouse believed his lie, he went to the meat and ate a small portion. He returned to the mouse with his appetite satisfied and a belly full. However, the cat soon began to long for the meat once more, so he dreamt up another lie to the mouse. The mouse, being trustworthy, believed the cat, and the cat went back to the jar and feasted once more upon the stored meat. Even after 2 feasts upon the meat, the day came when the cat was still not satisfied with his prior feasts, and until then, once more, dreamt up a lie to the mouse. The mouse grew suspicious of the cat, but let him leave once more. The cat returned to the meat and ate the rest of the spoils, leaving none in the jar. When the cat returned, the mouse questioned the cat. The cat tried to lie, but the mouse caught wise. As the mouse began to accuse the cat of eating their food, the cat grew tired of the questions. So the cat snapped up the mouse in one fell swoop and swallowed the mouse whole, filling the cat's belly once more. Twilight looked at the story with confused awe. The moral seemed confusing. The message seemed unclear. Though the story had a beginning, middle, and end, she couldn't tell for what purpose the story was written, or the relevance it had to being near the puzzle piece. She decided to ponder on it not anymore, and she surrounded the paper and combined it with the other papers she was storing inside of her magic. "All right, let's find the other puzzle pieces, Spike," Twilight said, confirming their plan of action. Spike nodded in agreement, and they quickly left the study room. They wandered back through the small maze made from the reference section, Twilight eyeing the body of the creature once more as she passed it, before quickly returning to the main library. All right. According to the main library map, the next piece is actually fairly close. There's about 12 bookshelves in the main room, and it should be in a walkway between rows 3 and 4. Twilight spoke optimistically as she walked to the main library room. She could see the bookshelves coming into view now. She scanned her light across the shelves, seeing them in the same state of disrepair as the ones in the reference section. Dust was covering several books, and she could see the grime start to climb up the sides of the bookshelves. She moved the light to look down the center aisle of all the bookshelves, hoping to spot a puzzle piece between the second and third shelves. Instead, her pendant fell upon a pile of books that was blocking her path. She let out a soft sigh, scanning her light upwards. The pile of books seemed unnaturally neat, and stopped at the top of the bookshelf. Of course. This area is going to be a maze too. Twilight sighed softly. She turned to the left and walked down the aisle of bookshelves, 1 and 2, trying to find a way around the puzzle piece. How many more monsters do you think are in here? Spike asked nervously, trying to keep an eye on the darkness around him, though it was difficult to see anything not illuminated by the pendant. I don't know, Spike. I'm trying not to think about it right now, Twilight said, trying to shake the thought from her mind. At the end of the row, she could see a line of study rooms that lined the wall just beyond the bookshelves. To her left, she could see the public bathrooms, and to the right, more shelves and study rooms. Each of the doors to the study rooms seemed to have fallen to the same disrepair as the first room door she had seen. Well, Twilight began to think, pulling the map out once more. I assume we'll be able to reach each piece, but the library has been turned into a maze against us. So all we have to do is figure out which sections are blocked, which ones aren't, and find our way around. She viewed the map carefully before sighing. I wish I'd grabbed some quills and ink before we'd left. Here you go, Spike said suddenly, producing a red quill and a small bottle of ink. I figured you'd want them eventually. Wow, I suppose you are my number one assistant for a reason. Twilight smiled, grabbing the items in her magic and dripping the quill into the ink. So they began to mark the map with where she had seen piles of books. With that in mind, she began to walk towards the back of the library, following along the wall. She marked off piles of books that blocked her way between shelves 2 and 3, but saw that the path through shelves 3 and 4 was open. Hoping she'd get closer to the puzzle piece, she began walking down it, though she didn't get far before she saw the end was also blocked by a pile of books. She sighed softly and marked it off on the map. Then, as she was turning to head back, she saw a particularly notable red book sticking out from the shelves. Curious, she levitated the book off the shelf. The cover read, The Old Widow. Twilight opened the book up and read what was inside. In a certain large town, there once lived a poor widow, who sat every evening thinking of everyone she had lost. Her husband, her son, all her relatives and friends, so that she was quite alone in the world. Her heart grew sorrowful with her thoughts. But the loss of her son troubled her the most, and she wept very bitterly. One day, she sat quite still, lost in her thoughts, when she began to hear bells ringing from the town hall. She wondered how she had spent all of the night sorrowing. But lighting her lantern, she went into the hall. As she entered, she saw it already lit up, but not with the usual tapers, but glimmering lights shone through the whole building. It was already filled with ponies who stood, seemingly to await their deeds for the day. When the widow walked to her normal spot, she found that it was already filled. As she looked around at the ponies, she perceived that they were all deceased relatives, who sat there in their old everyday dresses, with pale countenances. They neither spoke nor sung, but a gentle whisper and hum floated through the hall. Presently, an aunt of the poor widow got up and said to her, "Look towards the steps, and you will see your son." She looked and saw her son hanging from the gallows. "See," continued the aunt, "thus it would have happened to your son, had life been given to him. Instead, they were mercifully taken away when they were but an innocent." With trembling steps, the old widow went home, and thanks to the heavens for their mercy. Then on the 3rd day after, she laid down on her bed and died. "What's that, Twilight?" Spike asked, just as Twilight finished reading the story. "I'm not sure, Spike." Twilight furrowed her brow in confusion, closing the little red book. It was sticking out of the bookshelf, and unlike the rest of the books here, was practically clean. What? Spike asked, confused. It's pristine, undamaged. It hadn't fallen into disrepair like the other books have. Twilight sighed, vanishing the book into her magic. Oh, well, if you say so, Spike said, confused, causing Twilight to slowly roll her eyes before exiting the aisle. She continued along the wall slowly, marking off the blocked paths between rows 4 and 5, before coming to a stop between 5 and 6. The medallion started to buzz once more.